War requires one thing above all else. It requires that you see the man opposite you as a monster, an abstraction, a thing to be erased, an unhuman thing. But in the winter of 1914, along the Western Front, this simple, terrible rule was about to be broken. The war was new, but it was already the most brutal conflict in human history. The mud, the wire, and the blood of a generation had frozen solid. And in that frozen silence, a strange and powerful magic was stirring. A force that diplomats and generals could not comprehend. It was a force that began not with an order, but with a song. Not with a shell, but with a simple message written on the heart. This is the story of the soldiers who defied an empire, who broke the logic of war itself, by writing a letter called Peace. The year was 1914. The world was tearing itself apart. The great powers of Europe, bound by a complex web of alliances and ambitions, had plunged into a conflict that would become known as the Great War. It was supposed to be over by Christmas. That was the promise. The politicians and the generals had assured the young men of Britain, Germany, and France that it would be a quick, glorious affair. They marched off in August, in crisp uniforms, to the sound of cheering crowds, expecting adventure. What they found was hell. The 19th century tactics of cavalry charges and marching infantry lines collided with the cold 20th century mechanics of the machine gun. The result was slaughter on an industrial scale. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. The race to the sea had ended in a stalemate. And from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a vast bleeding scar was carved across the face of Europe. They called it the Trench. This was not a temporary ditch. It was a new form of human existence. It was a sprawling, subterranean city of misery. To understand what happened that Christmas, you must first understand this place. You must descend into the earth. Let us go there now. Imagine a ditch, perhaps 7 feet deep, 6 feet wide, zigzagging across the Belgian and French countryside. The walls are made of wet, collapsing earth, held up by sandbags. These sandbags are not the clean, dry bags you might imagine. They are perpetually damp, rotting, and smell of mildew and decay. Under your feet is not solid ground, but a thick, wooden duckboard. And beneath that duckboard, water. A freezing, gray, stagnant soup that seizes the feet and never, ever leaves. This is the front line. This is a world defined by its senses. The smell, first. It is overwhelming. It is the odor of chloride of lime used to combat disease. It is the smell of unwashed bodies, packed together for warmth. It is the sharp, metallic tang of cordite from the artillery shells. It is the sweet, sickly smell of putrefaction, wafting from no man's land. And it is the smell of cooking, a thin bacon, perhaps, or a weak tea, a fragile reminder of a home that now feels 1,000,000 miles away. Then, the sound. The war is never silent. Even in a quiet sector, there is the constant, distant rumble of artillery. The thud-thud-thud of a heavy gun miles away, the high-pitched, angry crack of a sniper's rifle, followed by the zip of the bullet passing your head, and most terribly, the sound of the rats. They were everywhere, enormous, emboldened creatures that scurried in the dark, feasting on the refuse of the living and the bodies of the dead, and the cold. By December 1914, it was a bitter, biting cold. It seeped into the wool of the uniforms. It turned the mud into a solid, jagged crust. It caused trench foot, a rot that consumed the flesh, turning feet black and gangrenous. This was the context. This was the machine. The men inside it were not warriors of legend. They were postmen and factory workers and farmers. They were German men named Karl and Wilhelm, who had been told the British were monsters. They were British men named Thomas and Arthur, who had been told the Germans were barbarians. And for 4 months they had been trying and failing to kill each other. The war machine was designed to dehumanize, to turn a baker from Berlin or a clerk from Birmingham into a target. But the machine had a flaw. It was operated by human beings. As December deepened, something began to shift. The scale of the death had numbed them. The pointlessness of the daily routine, stand to at dawn, sniper fire, artillery, stand to at dusk, had created a strange, shared cynicism. The men in the British trenches and the men in the German trenches, sometimes only 50 yards apart, were living the exact same life. They endured the same rain, cursed the same rats, and feared the same shells. Then came the letters from home. This was a psychological event in itself. The mailbags arrived, filled with cards, parcels, and whispers of a world that had vanished. A German soldier would read of his children lighting the Tannenbaum. An English soldier would receive a plum pudding or a knitted scarf. These small objects, these fragile pieces of paper, were Trojan horses of humanity. They carried memories of family, of faith, of carols, of peace, and they arrived in a place dedicated only to violence. The men in charge knew this was dangerous. The High Command issued strict orders. Fraternization with the enemy was forbidden. It was considered treason. General Sir Horace Smith Dorrien of the British Second Corps issued a stern directive. On no account is intercourse to be allowed between the opposing trenches. The war had to remain pure in its hatred, but a letter from home is more powerful than an order from a general. It began slowly. Small tentative gestures. In some sectors, a German soldier would hold up a sign. "You know, shoot. We know, shoot." In another, a Tommy might shout a question about the news. The reply would come back in broken English. These were the first fragile threads of contact. They were testing the ice. This shared curiosity, this recognition of a shared suffering, is a powerful force. The stories of men who chose conscience over conflict are a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. If you believe these stories of moral courage must be remembered, help us to keep telling them. Take a moment to subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to honoring the better angels of our nature. The real moment came on Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, 1914. The day was quiet. The usual shelling had died down, as if the cannons themselves were observing a holiday. The sky was clear and the air was sharp with an intense frost. As darkness fell over the snow-dusted ruins of Flanders, the men settled in for another miserable night. And then it happened. From the German trenches, a light appeared. Then another, and another. British soldiers, peering nervously over their parapets, could not believe what they were seeing. The German front line was being decorated. Small Christmas trees, the Tannenbäume sent from home, were being placed on the sandbags, their candles flickering bravely in the dark. A British private, stationed near Ypres, wrote about it later. "We were confused," he said. "We thought it was a trick, a new kind of ruse to get us to show our heads. We began firing at them. The lights went out. The silence returned, deeper, more accusatory. Then, from the darkness, came a new sound. It was not the sound of a rifle. It was not the sound of artillery. It was a voice, a single German voice, high and clear, singing a song. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The men of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers listened. They knew the tune. The sound was pure. It was beautiful. It cut through the stench of the trenches and the memory of violence. One voice was joined by another, and then another, until a full chorus of German soldiers was singing Silent Night to their enemies. This was the letter. This was the message. It was not written on paper. It was written on the air itself. When the song finished, the silence that followed was profound. The British soldiers, moved beyond words, did the only thing they could. They applauded. They shouted, "Encore!" and "Good, Fritz." Then, a British soldier, a man named Thomas, cleared his throat and began to sing in reply. The first Noel. The Germans applauded. And then the impossible happened. They began to sing together. A German tenor began O Tannenbaum, and the British, who knew the melody as the Red Flag, began to hoot and cheer. Then a brave soul from the British side shouted across the dark, frozen expanse, "Come over, Fritz!" A reply came back. "No, you come over." A pause. Then a new voice, a German officer, shouted, "No, come over." "But we send officer. If you send officer, we meet. In middle." This was the moment, the turning point. The machine was breaking. In the darkness of no man's land, two figures climbed out of their respective trenches. They were unarmed. They advanced cautiously. Two captains, one British, one German. They walked on the frozen mud, past the shell craters, past the skeletal remains of the barbed wire. They met. They bowed stiffly. They spoke. And they shook hands. They agreed. A truce. Just for Christmas. No shooting. All along the front, in dozens of different sectors, this same scene was playing out. It was not organized. It was not commanded. It was spontaneous. It was an outbreak of peace. Christmas Day, 1914, the sun rose on a scene that history has never forgotten. It was a sight that should have been impossible. Men who had been trained for months to view each other as devils, as subhuman targets, climbed out of their trenches. They did not run. They walked, slowly, hesitantly, their hands open or held high. They were moving into no man's land, the most dangerous place on earth, a place that meant certain death just 24 hours earlier. And they met. A German soldier, a private from Saxony, described the feeling. "I saw them," he wrote. "I saw the English. I looked at them, and I did not see a monster. I saw a man with a tired face and a beard, just like mine." He smiled. They spoke. Their languages were a barrier, but not an insurmountable one. Many Germans had worked in England before the war, as waiters or barbers. They acted as interpreters. They spoke of home. They spoke of the cold. They spoke, with a shared bitter irony, of the leaders who had sent them there. Then, the gifts. They exchanged the small treasures of their parcels from home. The British offered plum pudding, tins of jam, and cigarettes. The Germans, possessing finer things, offered cigars, brandy, and schnapps. They traded buttons from their tunics as souvenirs. A German infantryman would proudly pin a British regimental button to his Feldgrau tunic, and a British Tommy would pocket a button with the German crown. They showed each other photographs. This is the psychological core of the event. A German soldier, perhaps a man named Otto, holds out a worn photograph of his wife and two small children in Munich. An English soldier, Arthur, looks at it and pulls out his own photo of a wife and child in Coventry. In that moment, the entire artifice of war, the propaganda, the hatred, the posters of the barbaric Hun, it all evaporated. It was revealed as a grotesque and tragic lie. The enemy was a father. The enemy was afraid. The enemy was you. But the truce was not just about conversation. There was work to be done. The most sacred part of the truce was the burial of the dead. For months, the bodies of fallen comrades had been left to rot in no man's land. Neither side could retrieve them under the constant sniper fire. Now, in this strange, holy peace, they worked together. British and German soldiers formed joint burial parties. They carried the broken bodies of their friends and their enemies. They held joint funeral services. A British chaplain would read a psalm, and a German Lutheran pastor, a soldier in their ranks, would read it in his own tongue. They stood side by side, helmets off, heads bowed, honoring the men they had killed. They were not British or German. They were just men, mourning the dead, in the middle of a wasteland. And then, the most famous event of all, the football match. It was just as absurd and just as beautiful as it sounds. Someone produced a ball, or perhaps it was a rolled-up sandbag or a tin can. It doesn't matter. In a frozen turnip field, Somewhere near the village of Frelinghien, the game began. It wasn't an organized match. It was a chaotic, joyful kickabout. Coats were thrown down for goalposts. Men in heavy boots, weighed down by their wool uniforms, slid and laughed on the icy ground. A German wrote that the 133rd Saxon Regiment played the 134th. A British soldier claimed the score was 3-2 to the Germans. It was, perhaps, the most important football game ever played. For a few hours, they were not soldiers. They were just young men kicking a ball. The war, the generals, the kings and kaisers, they all seemed very, very far away. The only sound was laughter. This moment, this defiant act of shared joy in the face of oblivion, represents a deep and profound truth about the human condition. We are not built to hate. We are built to connect. These stories, where our shared humanity overrides our divisions, are the most important stories we have. They remind us of who we are and who we can be. If you are moved by this defiant act of peace, please consider sharing this story. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of winters, light can find a way. Help us share that light, but the machine does not tolerate such humanity. The machine fights back. The news of the truce, which spread up and down the line, was met with absolute fury by the High Command. From their comfortable chateaus, miles behind the front, the generals were apoplectic. This was not war. This was mutiny. If soldiers realized their enemy was just a reflection of themselves, the war could not continue. The very foundation of the conflict would crumble. The governments, the arms manufacturers, the leaders who had staked their reputations on victory. They could not allow this. The orders that came down were no longer suggestions. They were threats. Fraternization will be punished by court-martial. Any soldier communicating with the enemy will be shot. The war machine began to deliberately break the peace. Snipers were ordered to find targets. Artillery units were commanded to begin saturation shelling of the friendly sectors. Regiments that had fraternized too eagerly were pulled from the line, disbanded, and sent to other, more brutal fronts like Verdun or the Somme, where the sheer scale of the killing would reinstill the proper hatred. The soldiers, those men who had shared brandy and photographs, were forced back to their trenches. The end of the truce was as heartbreaking as its beginning was magical. In many sectors, the truce had lasted for days, but the time had come. A German officer would walk to the center of no man's land and bow to his British counterpart. "We must return to our trenches," he would say. "We will begin firing again in 1 hour. We will aim high, but God knows we do not want to do this." The men who had shaken hands now looked at each other with a new, shared sadness. They were, once again, trapped. A soldier from the London Rifle Brigade described the end. He and a German soldier he had befriended, a man from Bavaria, shook hands one last time. "C'est toyen, goodbye," the German said. "Today we are friends. Tomorrow you are my enemy, and I am yours." They walked away from each. They climbed back down into their respective ditches. And then a single shot, a rifle, fired high into the air. A warning. The truce was over. The machine had restarted. The war, which would consume millions more lives, which would grind on for 4 more terrible years, had resumed. The Christmas truce was never repeated. The High Command made sure of it. The war became too bitter. The introduction of poison gas, of relentless, year-long battles, of propaganda that painted the enemy as a demonic force. All this ensured that the magic of 1914 would remain a singular event. It was covered up. It was censored. It was dismissed as a myth because it was too dangerous. It was a story that told the truth. So what was the letter that stopped a battle? It was not a single document. It was not signed by a king or a politician. It was a letter written by thousands of ordinary men. It was a letter that began with a flickering candle on a Tannenbaum. It was a letter sung in the key of Silent Night. It was a letter written with a shared cigarette, a traded button, a photograph of a child. It was a message that said, "We are human. We are the same, and this war is a lie." The men who participated in that truce were profoundly changed. They had seen the man behind the mask. They had been given the impossible choice of returning to the machine or holding on to the truth they had discovered. They fought on, but they fought with a broken heart. They knew with absolute certainty the profound absurdity of their task. The legacy of the Christmas truce is not that it ended the war. It did not. It is that it revealed the truth of the war. It proved that the lines drawn on a map are not as strong as the bonds that connect the human heart. It showed that our capacity for compassion, for empathy, for peace is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength. It is an instinct that must be actively and brutally suppressed, or it will overwhelm us. This story endures, not as a fairy tale, but as a promise. It is a reminder that the world we live in is a choice. The hatreds we are taught are a choice. The divisions we accept are a choice. And at any moment, we can choose differently. At any moment, we can decide to start singing. This story is a monument to the soldiers who, for one brief shining day, taught the world a lesson it has yet to fully learn. A lesson in courage, a lesson in faith, and a lesson in what it truly means to be human. If this story of defiant peace resonated with you, let it be more than a passing anecdote. Let it be a reminder. Share this message of hope and join us in telling the stories that matter. The stories that prove that even in the deepest, coldest winter, a light can and will always find a way to shine.